Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk podcast, where we bring you expert insights and geopolitical perspectives on Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, including foreign security policy, geoeconomic trends, as well as the geopolitical picture. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Parmaswaran. If you haven't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com. Our guest today is James Crabtree, who has worked at several prior roles, including a senior advisor to the British Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and director of the IISS think tank in Singapore, where he helped run the Shangri-La Dialogue. He's currently, among other things, a distinguished visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We'll start our conversation talking through some of the dynamics in Europe, Southeast Asia, and the broader geopolitical and geoeconomic canvas. Be sure to stay tuned as we go through a range of other subjects, including the agenda for Europe-Southeast Asia relations and policy in the coming months, as well as related topics, including how things are shaping up with respect to worldviews in Washington, but also in Beijing, New Delhi, and other Indo-Pacific capitals. So welcome to the podcast, James. Great to have you. And let's start, if we can, on the series of geoeconomic deals that we're seeing coming out of Europe over the past year. We've seen just recently a deal coming out with India. There's one with Mercosur. If we go a little bit further back, we're seeing a number of Southeast Asian negotiations as well, including the negotiation with Indonesia, which I think some Indonesian officials who've been involved with this for a long time would admit they didn't really see actually coming, because it's been going along for quite a while. How do you see this sort of geoeconomic momentum fitting into where Europe sees its role, not just in Southeast Asia, but also the Indo-Pacific and globally? Because some of this is, you've been tracking this stuff for decades. Southeast Asia now, after the United States and China, is Europe's basically third largest trade market in the aggregate. So some of this is structural, but some of this in terms of the energy, the policy dynamics feels a little bit new, and there does feel to be a little bit more momentum on it. So how do you assess this in terms of the momentum, but also the broader sort of policy significance?
Well, so thanks very much for having me. I mean, I think, as with almost everything in life at the moment, it comes down to the Trump factor, which is that Europe has a kind of geopolitical crisis on its hands, in as much as since the end of the Second World War, it has had a very close relationship with the United States. To put it mildly, that relationship is a bit rocky now, and so it's looking for new friends. I mean, what India would call a policy of multi-alignment is now something that Europe is trying to do. It's trying to hedge and diversify. And so if you look at, well, what does that look like, then yeah, Latin America, the Mercosur deal has been on the cards for an awfully long time, but is now, to some greater or lesser degree, being signed and will come into force. I mean, there's a little bit of a hiccup because of a kind of cock up in the European Parliament, but I think the sense is that they'll get over that and that will come into force. Ursula von der Leyen was recently in the Middle East, trying to do a little bit of Middle East diplomacy, and then the big one is India, which we'll talk about in a minute. I think the EU-India free trade agreement, which happened recently, and so I think as is true with many other countries in India, in Southeast Asia, in elsewhere. A world in which the United States is less reliable and more coercive is one where traditional US allies and partners have to look around and see what else is out there. And in a sense, it's no more complicated than that. Europe is looking for new friends, both at the kind of geoeconomic level, but also at the geostrategic level. And it's trying to build what it can to make up for what it's lost in terms of this newly unreliable relationship with Washington.
And just to follow up on that quickly, James, so what you mentioned on Europe and the sort of framing against what's happening in the United States, to what extent is it? Because we've seen some European officials, and I've heard European officials try to make the case that in this geoeconomic and geopolitical canvas and landscape, countries and regions need to increasingly be thinking about Europe and the European Union as an independent pole or actor, not so much in the sort of archaic notion of the transatlantic relationship and the Europe being mostly an economic factor, not really a security factor, that there needs to be a recognition of this as a shifting dynamics among poles, but also between poles, right? And how they've been traditionally seen. To what extent do you find that that is a sort of credible sort of argument to make? And how do you see countries and actors, like you mentioned India there, for example, adjusting to this landscape and how they're rethinking and seeing Europe as an actor? Because Europe has been trying to make this case for a long time. But I do sense that there's a little bit of a change in the weather with respect to the conversation now.
You know what, Prashant? I think it's almost the other way around. I mean, I think the partners got there before the Europeans.
Hmm.
I think if you so that what you're the line that you're quoting, that Europe is an independent pole in a multipolar order, is not actually a line from a European. It's a line from Dr. Jaishankar, the
Hmm.
Indian External Affairs Minister, as I think you probably know. And in a sense, I think that India, for instance, has looked at Europe for a long time. I mean, for at least the last 5 years, and thought, that in the world in which we're heading for, then we need to treat Europe as a pole on its own that is separate from the United States and other relationships. And I think, in a funny way, it's almost taken Trump for the Europeans, or for, I mean, maybe not the French, but for many of the rest of the Europeans who are pretty strongly Atlanticist, to kind of make a psychological break with the United States. To some greater or lesser extent, we don't know what this will look like in the medium to long term, but for now, anyway. Um, and I think here, yeah, I mean, I think Europe has a strong um, story to tell, maybe stronger than it realizes. As in, if you're sitting in, Malaysia or Indonesia or Singapore, and you're thinking about, okay, the US is less reliable, so, what are our diversification plays? Then, it's not you have Northeast Asia, the sort of the democracies, the advanced democracies of Asia. You have India, you have the Middle East, Canada maybe, but really Europe is one of the big, one of the big kind of hedging opportunities that any country that is looking to hedge and diversify would look to, because it is, to be fair, Europe is geopolitically declining, relatively speaking, but it is still full of rich, technologically advanced nations. Europe is also rearming. It's spending a lot more on its military, and therefore, I mean, an argument that I've been making for the last 2 years really is that the story that Europe can tell about itself is very different post Ukraine than before Ukraine. The notion that Europe was this sort of slightly peculiar postmodern trading conglomeration that didn't have anything to say in terms of hard security. Well, it's not really true anymore. This is a continent and a European apparatus that has been at the very forefront of the most important military conflict in the world, that has been raising money to fund that conflict, that has been trying to manage geopolitical relationships around that conflict. And so if you take Europe, in sum, not just Brussels, but within Europe, you have, four or five of the world's most capable middle powers. So the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine itself. And then if you add Turkey into the mix as a NATO member, that's six serious global middle powers, not major powers in the sense of China, Russia, India, um, but capable military middle powers. And I think if you add that together, then in a sense that is why India would say that Europe is a pole in a multipolar order. And I think it's actually been the Europeans that have been slow to tell that story about themselves, and only latterly have kind of caught up with the way some of the rest of the world has viewed them.
Hmm. And I guess the other piece of that is what you mentioned earlier about the changing geopolitical perspective in Europe, but also within European countries as well, right? Because I think it's difficult to get away from the remarks of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos and his notion of okay, we're in a moment of rupture rather than transition in the world order. Middle powers need to sort of collaborate more with each other. And I actually agree with you, what you said earlier, that parts of the region, including in Southeast Asia, have been ahead of this conversation already, right? The sense of geopolitical and geoeconomic rupture and the so-called rules-based order has been recognized for a long time, and countries have been adjusting to that. But to what extent do you think Europe fits into this kind of middle power conversation? Because as we both know, even the term middle power, right? There sort of there's ambivalence in some capitals about, well, should we really use the term? We're accepting sort of a hierarchy of powers. Maybe we want to be a little bit bigger than we're perceived, and so on and so forth. But beyond the sort of nomenclature, what is the kind of configuration that we're talking about? You sort of mentioned there a number of middle powers individually in Europe. There's also notions of the EU and the European Union as kind of a collective pole. But are you seeing some changing notions within Europe about how to think about its own geopolitical and geoeconomic map in terms of not just the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, India, and China, and so on and so forth, but also diversifying more globally? You mentioned, Mercosur area earlier that we talked about in Latin America. But is that also changing in terms of Europe's own worldview?
I mean, I think if you look at the Europe India event that happened recently, when at the Brussels level, then that moment was, in a sense, a pan-European moment. And so some of these agreements happen at the Brussels level. That it's a Brussels that makes the big trade deals. But there are a number of other kind of competencies which can sit at the European level, and Ursula von der Leyen is probably the most recognizable European Commission president in a long time. So in a sense, I think Brussels and Europe is now taken more seriously as a strategic as opposed to a trading partner. And so there is this, on the one hand, you can see Europe in terms of its economic weight, and increasingly to some degree in terms of its strategic weight, in that group of the world's largest powers. The European Union, in some ways, sits next to the United States, China, India, aspirationally, to some degree, Russia, as part of a grand bloc. But then within that, you also have the European middle powers. And in some areas, particularly defense and security, these relationships are still predominantly bilateral. And therefore, India is buying French Rafale jets and German submarines and whatever it might be, striking a trade and sort of security deals with technology and security deals with the United Kingdom, for instance. So I think it's a little bit more complicated because you have this both transnational and national element with Europe. But I don't think if lying behind your question is, in a sense, has there been this sort of jarring fall to earth in which European nations are struggling to conceive of themselves as global middle powers? I don't really think so. I mean, that may have been true sort of 20 or 30 years ago, but I think now, anyone in a European capital, I mean, in the big ones, the ones that I mentioned, would conceive of themselves as sort of, high capacity global middle powers who are able to do things within the global system, but who are not able to operate at the same level as the really big countries. And I think that's fine, I mean, but one of the things that Europe does have is it has quite a lot of these sort of capable, high-tech, prosperous middle powers, and therefore, particularly if they act together, then they have quite a lot of weight still in the global system. And again, that's not me saying this as a European, if you said to me. I mean, I think that's what others see. That's what Southeast Asian nations, it's what India sees, and in a funny way, the Europeans are, they're not as easy to deal with as the United States because there are lots of them and they're complicated. They also don't offer you what the United States offers. They don't have whacking great big tech companies, for instance, that in the same way. But they are sort of reasonably reliable in a way that the Trump administration isn't. They're certainly not erratic in the way that the Trump administration isn't. And therefore, if you're looking for kind of a sort of set of powers with whom you can do business, then it's the same with Japan or South Korea. The kind of the rump G7 that they offer something that many countries see as quite valuable.
Right, and to that point, James, so just to follow up, how would you characterize? I mean, we're talking about this era, as you mentioned, of diversification, where I think most countries that are thinking about the world strategically and have a sort of long-term strategic perspective are looking at diversification opportunities. And in those diversification opportunities lies the sort of big perennial question, which is to what extent do each of these individual actors produce a sort of value add, right, within this kind of landscape? What would you say if you're looking at Europe and the European Union would be that sort of value add in terms of opportunities that Europe offers? I mean, and one thing that I think really strikes me in Southeast Asia is there's often this notion in Washington that Europe is kind of associated with regulation and lots of rules and so on and so forth. But actually, in Southeast Asia, as you well know, some of these governments are pretty comfortable with regulation and rulemaking. And so, in some of these conversations, like the digital conversation, Washington is having a little bit of a challenge as it's advocating its own worldview, but there are other power centers, including in Europe, that are advocating a different worldview in that respect. And some of those views actually align more with some of what we're seeing in these Southeast Asian capitals. So I guess what's your perspective on this kind of value add conversation piece?
I think it's complicated, right? There are things that the European Union does at the Brussels level, which countries in Southeast Asia don't like at all. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is one of the ways, it's a sort of European tool to try and manage climate change, which to some degree penalizes poorer countries. They hate that. And so that bit of European rulemaking they strongly dislike. There are other rules that Europe has which are not very popular. But at a sort of more basic level, particularly when you're thinking about Southeast Asia, then there's a kind of underlying agreement, I think, that although countries in South and Southeast Asia tend not to be very keen on what we used to call the liberal rules-based order, they are keen on a rules-based order. They don't like the notion. Most of them are small to medium-sized countries, and small to medium-sized countries do not like the idea of a kind of gradual sort of collapse back into a world in which the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. And therefore, there is a kind of congruence between European nations and Southeast Asian nations. So, for instance, if you take something like wanting to have UNCLOS and rules of the sea, then actually having European nations around is quite helpful because they give some ballast to the idea that these are rules that cannot simply be kind of ripped up by great powers at their whim. So I think at a basic level, both Europeans and Southeast Asians, and actually it's true of India as well, they might disagree over what the rules should be in a rules-based international order, but at least for now, they do want to have an order that is rules-based, albeit not liberal. I mean, so I think one of the things that Europeans have learned to do is there's a friend of mine in Germany who had the line which he used at, I think, the last Ricina dialogue, that Europeans have gradually learned to be less strategically obnoxious. And so they've sort of ceased to a large degree going around and South and Southeast Asia wagging fingers and talking about human rights and generally annoying people. And that has helped because in neither jurisdiction did anybody particularly welcome being given lectures by, sort of Swedes and Dutch people about the state of their internal politics. And so to the degree that Europe has kind of put a lid on that, then that has helped. In terms of what Europe has to offer, I think it's pretty clear, right? I mean, it's still the world's largest market, and therefore the trade deals are huge. If you are in the business of striking trade deals, then the European Union is one of the most important ones that you can strike. For Southeast Asia, I think I think, I mean, it has over recent years been the most important trading partner. I don't know kind of where it stands with China at the moment, but it's sort of been there or thereabouts in terms of the most important trading partner. Technology, I think, would be the second thing that I would point to. Again, as I said before, not as easy as the United States, because it doesn't have the hyperscalers like Google or big AI companies, which everyone wants a piece of. But it has a lot of underlying technology, both in terms of manufacturing, industrial technology, pharmaceuticals, deep tech, in the sense of the research base in the large European universities. So it's a little bit more difficult to kind of get out of European companies, but it does exist, and that's very valuable for developing economies in South and Southeast Asia. And then I think there's a bunch of other stuff which is newer. As I say, defense and security partnerships, not just at the level of the larger nation states, but also at the Brussels level, as you saw with the Defense and Security Pact that was done between the European Union and India. Supply chains and economic security is a big concern of Europe. And so, I mean, that's an agenda that's being more fleshed out with respect to India, where both sides have big concerns about China. It's maybe less advanced with Southeast Asia, where countries in Southeast Asia view China as a more kind of balanced proposition as opposed to more of a threat competitor, which I think is true in both Europe and India. And maybe the sort of green tech transition would be another. So I think that there's a lot of areas of kind of common interest. And the point I would go back to making is that particularly on kind of defense and security in the sense of hard security, but also economic security, the sort of the potential partnerships in areas like critical raw materials or supply chains are reasonably new. I mean, this wasn't something that we were talking about pre-COVID and in a sense the way that China has changed over recent years, and to some degree the way the US has now changed. And so I think Europe has things to offer on all of those. It's not the perfect partner, but then nobody is. So in a sense, out there in the world of trying to find people with whom you can diversify, you have to take the countries as they are. And that, as I say, it's a reasonably small series of buckets of sort of East Asian democracies, Middle Eastern sort of oil emirates, and Europeans are kind of your big plays if you're sitting in South or Southeast Asia, I think.
Right. And just to follow up on that, James, so as we look at some of the future looking agenda items for Europe and Southeast Asia, there's an upgrade that's planned already for 2027. And so some of the areas that you mentioned in terms of the green economy, the digital economy, these are conversations that are already occurring. Supply chains, as you mentioned, is another key area. One of the things that is really striking, though, is even though, as both you and I know, this notion of economic security, there are debates around how new this is and so on and so forth. But when we get beyond the sort of nomenclature, the fact is we are seeing more of a conversation on this concept of economic security and the confluence of geoeconomic and geopolitical trends. I think even Europe just came out with an economic security strategy, essentially, that came out of the EU in December last year. There's a lot more conversations that are happening in Southeast Asia, but also, frankly, even in the United States and Washington, there's a lot more conversations about this as well. But how do we think about this agenda of diversification and partnerships, and how this kind of economic security piece factors into that? Some of that is supply chains and individual sectors, but what are some of the areas that you're looking at particularly as we head into the rest of this year and into 2027 in particular?
Well, I mean, so